Hello and welcome everyone. The Society of Petroleum Engineers is pleased to present this webinar, Geothermal and Petroleum Engineering, Where Subsurface Meets. I'm Rebecca Schulz. I am your moderator for today. I am the co-chair of the Geothermal Working Group and vice chair of our upcoming Geothermal Technical section, as well as the chair of our Geothermal workshop coming up in December, from December 1st to 3rd. It's a virtual workshop. I hope you can join us then to dive further into this topic on geothermal and help decide how and where to move geothermal collaboration forward within SPE. What we hope to do today is to dive into the background of geothermal, where it has been, where do we see it going. There's a great deal of potential in geothermal that offers opportunities for oil and gas professionals around the world. And today we are joined by two amazing women, truly two forces of nature in the industry, Dr. Marit Brommer and Jamie Beard, and I would like to introduce the two of them. Marit Brommer is the Executive Director of the International Geothermal Association. She took seat in April 2017, coming as a veteran from the oil and gas sector with over a decade of experience in technology deployment and geoscience portfolio management. Marit is dedicated to the transition of the IGA into a professional body, renowned for its geothermal expertise, networking opportunities, and its global presence. Jamie Beard is the Executive Director of the Geothermal Entrepreneurship Organization at the University of Texas at Austin. It's an organization she founded in 2019. She also organizes and curates the Pivot from Hydrocarbons to Heat conference series. And I encourage you to look up Jamie's TED Talk that she delivered on the subject of geothermal and the oil and gas industry just back in August 2021. It's a great TED Talk. You'll also learn a lot from that. And we're going to learn a lot from both of these amazing women today. And so if I may bring both of them on, Marit and Jamie, welcome to SPE Live, and thanks for joining us.
Good day. Thank you. Yeah.
Jamie, if I may start with you, we have a lot of energy professionals and oil and gas professionals that may not have as much of a background and introduction into geothermal. Can you help describe for us what is geothermal? It seems that everyone has a different view of the definition of geothermal, and sometimes it feels as though it's almost several different industries all under one single umbrella. Can you give us a few thoughts and guidelines on how we should think about the geothermal industry now and how maybe we should think about it moving into the future?
Sure. So thanks. It's great to be here with good friends. So geothermal. Now, geothermal is all the useful ways we can use heat from the earth, and it falls in my mind into two buckets: direct use heat. So heating of buildings and homes, and also industrial uses of the heat. And then there's the electricity production angle. And that's where I focused most of my efforts. But in my mind, geothermal direct use heat is just as important as electricity production, use of geothermal for electricity production. Really, 50% of the opportunity in geothermal is using geothermal just for its heat. And it's an incredibly efficient way to heat buildings. And that's such a relevant topic right now in the news. So I don't think that we should underestimate the potential and importance of direct use as we discuss today for geothermal. So, the industry as it exists today versus the industry that I would hope for in the future, very, very different. So geothermal is kind of the redheaded stepchild of renewables, the so-called forgotten renewable, extraordinarily underappreciated. Many folks that I converse with day to day have either never heard of geothermal or have jumped immediately to the presumption that geothermal is irrelevant to their lives, is irrelevant to the future energy transition because it's just in Iceland, for instance. I mean, they connect geothermal with what they see now, and not what its potential is. But when I think of the future and what geothermal holds for the future, I see the solution to energy, right? And I see the potential to meet world energy demand. And I see a gigantic resource that it makes no sense we're not doing everything we can to leverage, right? So my view on geothermal is huge, is gigantic. It's something we really need to focus on, and it's something that the oil and gas industry is really well positioned to help with.
Thanks, Jamie. That's a great kickstart to this. And also it's a good lead in to a question that I think is really relevant for SPE members and petroleum engineers. If I can hand it over to Marit, coming from the oil and gas industry, can you talk a bit more about how oil and gas and geothermal relate? And they're both subsurface, but how are they similar and where are they different?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Becky, and of course, welcome all to this fantastic topic. And it's so good to see Jamie. So amazing. Yeah, so I always say, look, the similarity sits in the subsurface, and the dissimilarity and where things get different is absolutely at surface. That's where we completely have diverged from, let's say, oil and gas and then that geothermal space. So let's start first with the similarities, and that's the subsurface, because even in the subsurface we do different things. Obviously in geothermal we drill, especially for deep geothermal, we drill for hot fluids, for steam, hot water, hot brines, everything between 60 degrees Celsius, I'm in Celsius language here, and 280, even to 450 degrees, one of the hottest geothermal wells that have been drilled. And all that is to do electricity or direct use of that heat. And if you look at the type of subsurface settings and the reservoirs that we have been targeting, it's predominantly volcanics, it's granites, it's at your continental edges, margins, volcanic plays. But more and more these days, it's where your sedimentary basin sits. And that has to do with the notion that we don't need that big heat, if you like, if we want to use it just for the low carbon clean heat. And hence what you see, especially in continental Europe, but also in parts of Turkey, where carbonates and sandstones are being developed. Now, that's where the similarities really sit with oil and gas, because if there's one thing that oil and gas is good at, is drilling sedimentary reservoirs for its fluids, but then obviously for oil and gas. And of course, if you go into, let's say, the drilling technology, and if you look at the optimization of the asset management and all that, there are of course a vast amount of experience and capabilities in oil and gas that geothermal does not have. But because it's a niche in geothermal, we have other types of technologies that we have been able to, let's say, progress on, especially in the EGS setting, the enhanced geothermal setting, or the really hot stuff that the Icelanders and part of the oil and gas companies have been helping developing. But I think the challenge for us marrying the two, and this is also why it's so good to have strong advocates to constantly seeking that coalition of the willing and an action-oriented mindset, is because where it is different is absolutely in the downstream area, is at that surface area. Because look, geothermal does electricity, it does heat, and it has direct relationship with its customers, either through a PPA signed off with the grid company, so that's most of the time a public utility company, or a private entity that serves electricity to people and industry needs, or we do heat. And that, again, is a local-to-local business. Well, at most, maybe regional, if you bring in a heated network, for instance, in the district heating system. And that's fundamental different than oil and gas tends to do, because they're global, they're scaled, they're completely, in terms of their workflow, is completely dedicated towards the trading, geopolitically, very strong and secure. Because, when you produce oil at one country, it doesn't mean that you need to sell it in that same country. And that business model, that mindset, that I would really like to sort of combine and marry, because I think, Jamie, absolutely, the vast potential of seeing oil and gas stepping into the geothermal space is huge. And the mindset should also be on trying to find a leverage to understand the business model local to local.
It's interesting, Marit. I'm curious, I don't want to bridge out to our SPE Live audience as well, and let us know where you're calling in from, and do ask questions into the comments. If you drop them in there, we're going to be coming back to those in about 10 minutes or so, after we have a bit of scene setting from Marit and Jamie on this. So I want to pick up, Marit, from that point that you just made on the market and how different the market is for geothermal, and hand it back over to Jamie, if I can, to talk about what that could look like in the future. Because Jamie, you said this could be huge. So what does that look like, and how does that market transition moving forward?
So scale is my favorite question, because I think that this is probably the most underappreciated point when talking with folks about the enormous potential that the oil and gas industry holds for geothermal. Geothermal development globally right now is just tiny. And even if we did 10x or 100x or even 1,000x of what we're doing now in terms of development, it's still too small to matter, to make a dent in particularly if you're looking at future world energy demand in 2050, right? So, we've got to figure out a vehicle to make that leap into geothermal energy at oil and gas scale, right? And if we did that, if we were drilling, say, 50,000, 60,000, 80,000 wells a year globally, like that's what the oil and gas industry does without blinking. And if we were doing that, and we were doing that for, say, 20 years straight, all of a sudden we're talking about numbers. And I mean, just in terms of electricity production, that are extraordinarily significant. I mean, you're talking about approaching world energy demand. And so, this is where it's really curious that the world has not focused on this enough, because it truly could be a huge part of the energy mix by 2050, with an existing industry that's perfectly positioned to help scale it. And so, geothermal, in my mind, is the one avenue that over the coming decades would actually allow the oil and gas industry to grow instead of retract over the coming decades, using core competency. I'm not talking about pivoting into solar. I'm talking about using current skills, current assets, current workforce. And that is something that we all need to be really, really talking about and engaging about, because it's super exciting, not only for people that work in the oil and gas industry, but also the world that cares about energy transition and our ability to do it in time, right? Do it fast enough in time for 2050. So that's my thought on scale.
It's fascinating. It's a low carbon energy source that is so small today, but then how can it grow into the future? And I want to dive into that a little bit more. But perhaps for the SPE audience that's out there, if I can ask Marit, can you talk a little bit more? We're transitioning from, in this case with geothermal, from producing oil and gas and depleting reservoirs, and sometimes we use water for oil recovery or injecting other gas or other surfactants and things. In this case, you're producing heat out of the reservoir. Can you talk a bit more about that process? Because rock itself is a very low conductive medium. It doesn't heat back up very quickly. So how does that? Can you talk a little bit more about how that works in practice?
Yeah, sure. I think, look, there are a couple of technologies that are currently, that's the proven technology. And there is, of course, the whole new world out there that is probably going to game change quite a few concepts and ideas around how we produce that heat at subsurface. So if you take, for example, the difference between conventional geothermal, where you would need a producer and an injector well, where you would have a constant monitoring system of your reservoirs in terms of keeping it at certain pressure, re-injecting the fluid, having that evaluated also at service through your regulation and your regulatory frameworks, but also keeping an operational maintenance plan, field development plan in the oil and gas world active. from that, in the variety of settings that we've seen, I mean, it really is dependent on the type of geology, the reservoirs itself, the heat, the initial heat in place in that type of reservoir. And as a rule of thumb, the hotter it is, the easier it is to keep it flowing for a substantial amount of decades. Because the oldest geothermal plants that are still existing and still going strong, the ones in Iceland, in New Zealand, in Kenya in the 80s, Larderello, Italy in the last century, 1914, they're still going strong. But there are always, let's say, sites where geology is less favorable, where there is a lot of maintenance needs, where there is also, due to the geological setting, a few, let's say, hard bullets to bite when it comes down to fracturation, fractured reservoirs in general, risk mitigation principles around that in terms of optimizing the flow, in terms of, stimulating our reservoirs, as we call it. And that sort of asks, of course, for a very careful review of how well these reservoirs are operating under the current conventional geothermal technology players that we have. So I think in general, what you see is a rule of thumb: the lower the temperature, the easier it is to see that temperature declines, and hence that pressure declines as well, and that we need to optimize it by either drilling an infill well or seeing some depletion. And I know it's a different way of describing depletion if your hot rock cools down, basically, but that's the depletion of the reservoir itself in a conventional setting. I'm really excited, and I'm really curious to see, of course, in this coming, hopefully, few years to come, how what's framed under the geothermal anywhere and geothermal everywhere new technology players are bringing to this game. I know it's a very different approach as the conventional one, and I know there is still a lot of proof of concepts to do and a lot of demonstration on sites, but everything that has to do with that closed loop approach of not having to drill both a producer and an injector, but having connectivity between the pipes in the reservoir itself, or having a certain well configuration down there that's optimized in terms of its production and re-injection regime in a closed circle. I think that's exciting. And then you're leaning on something that we actually don't know yet very well, and that has been tested maybe in the shallow subsurface, maybe tested in the models in theory. But I think the real excitement and the real game changer is going to be in the coming years when we see all these closed loop technology actively deploying their technology in the real world, and also that monitoring and an enabling environment that helps to scale up. Because if there's one thing that I think where we should hold hands, is that we need to scale up also the policies and the financial instruments around that in order to allow geothermal to gain market share.
Marit, I think it's a great place perhaps for us to pause with that and just recapture and reconnect on the different types of geothermal technologies that you were just describing and Jamie was describing earlier. Because we started with direct heat and direct use, and there's a shallow component to that, and then there's a deeper component as well. So when we think about geothermal technologies, then we're thinking on one hand on ground source heat pumps and how do we heat buildings, for example, or some shallower to medium wells that might be used for heating light industry or aquaculture, swimming pools, things like this. Then we've got the conventional hydrothermal that you were talking about when we think of Iceland and the volcanoes and drilling these 400 degrees Celsius wells. And that's primarily for electricity generation. And then you touched on EGS and the deep closed loop systems. Can you perhaps just spend one more minute where you describe a bit more on what EGS is and what these new deep closed loop systems are and where they feature within this span of geothermal technologies? And I see we've got some great questions then from the audience, and so I'll switch over to some of those as well.
Yeah, just to say something on direct use. I know, with the shallow heat pumps, people really like that, and I'm also a strong advocate for that. But that to me is a complete different direct customer relationship than drilling for heat in sedimentary basins. What here in Europe is happening in Germany and in the Netherlands and in France and in Hungary. I mean, that's deep geothermal. That goes all the way to 5-6 kilometers depth, touching your average sand and carbonate reservoirs in order to get to that 70 to 90 degrees Celsius for direct use of heating your city networks, your buildings, and some industry purposes. So I do think it's good to always differentiate between shallow and deep. And then on top of that, we differentiate between who do we serve? Do we serve an individual consumer for a building via heat pumps? Or do we serve, an industry and a city council, for that matter, who wants to use low carbon heat? I also like to say EGS, and then maybe Jamie, you do the closed loop, because that's really, she knows much more about that than I do. So look, EGS in what we see, again, this is conventional. This has been going on for a long time. EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, it's where there is no water in the reservoir itself. Typically granites, very hot granites. Cornwall, classic example. Alsace in France, classic example. No water, meaning the producer and the injector need to be going down there where it's hot. And one is producing the injected water, cold water, that's being heated up by the rock itself. And that forms a loop system. And it also requires us to carefully manage and enhance the reservoir by calling that stimulation. And I've been always accused by Jamie that I sugarcoat it, but we do call that stimulation of the reservoir, because otherwise there is no flow, because we all know permeability is very poor in hot granites at 5 to 6 kilometers depth.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Marit. Jamie, you want to expand? Do you mind expanding on the deep closed loop systems that Marit was just mentioning?
Sure, but Marit, you're better. You're the better candidate than I for this. So closed loop, the concept of directionally drilling your wells, and really trying to minimize the need for enhancement or stimulation of the wells. But there's a couple of different concepts out there in closed loops. There's a lot of startups now that are running the race on this. Some of the closed loop concepts have multiple wells. Some of them are pipe and pipe single well systems. And there are, and that's in the pure closed loop category. There's even closed loop concepts that are aiming to reuse existing oil and gas wells for the purposes of producing heat, but in a closed loop format. Closed loop is really interesting because if you do achieve a true closed loop, you can use non-water working fluids. And so there you can optimize and engineer your working fluid to perform better than water. So, and I think that's a really exciting point about closed loops. They may be expensive, they may be harder to drill, but you can actually engineer a fluid to heat up faster than water, say, at temperatures lower than water, right? And that's where closed loop can really be promising, I think, for maybe mid-enthalpy type sedimentary plays. And I'll mention too that there are some startups out there that are seeking to combine EGS with closed loop. So there are some concepts out there that include both the closed loop format in that you're using a non-water working fluid, but they also fracture the reservoir around the well to increase heat transfer to try to address some of the technical issues around pure closed loop systems in the heat transfer area. So yeah, exciting times for closed loop. Closed loop, deep closed loop at least, is a newcomer though. So there are a lot of companies out there trying to demonstrate it and working on it, but a lot of data needs to be had before we can determine the outcomes there.
Thanks, Jamie. We've got a lot of good questions, so we've got time for probably about 2 or 3 of those before we're going to have to close out. And so the first one of those is from a LinkedIn user. So the question is, SMU's initial drive was for conversion of obsolete petroleum wells into geothermal wells, so reusing oil and gas wells for geothermal. Is that, the person says, they don't hear a lot about that lately. I think there is a fair bit of discussion and research going into that. But a very excellent point, I think, on the wells and diameters for oil and gas wells versus what we may need for producing either direct heat, either for using for direct use or for power production.
Marit, do you want to start? And then I'll touch on the startups when you're done.
Yeah, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Look, I think this is exciting times to review the massive amount of oil and gas wells that have been drilled and either are abandoned or are still in production. So there are some good examples of co-production, especially in France with Vermilion, where you see that it's possible, and hence there is appetite as well to review this potential, let's say, enormous again game changer for retrieving the heat that we know is down there. On the configuration, look, I know of a few studies who have tried to look at this from a business case point of view, and then the diameter is one thing. It is also the structural geology, where you place your well for oil might not be the best one for water, and because you're after the water in the reservoir, you may not need to be on top of the structural anticline, for instance. So you see a bit of that, and that has a huge impact on the business case, because either you need to do another infill well, or you need to configure the well, or you do all kinds of things to it in order to make it flow the way you want it to flow. And hence, sometimes it's even less costly to drill a new hole in the ground, so to speak. So I know of that. I do think there is a lot of appetite to look at it with the closed loop system, because then you're only after the heat, basically. You're only, and you're knowing exactly, based on the logging history, based on your reservoir maintenance, based on your optimization procedures, what the current temperature is bottom hole. And that can be exciting to go for it with a convincing business model in mind, that you can retrieve in a closed loop configuration, that you can retrieve that heat and generate either electricity if it's hot enough, or use that heat directly to warm up an industry cluster or the built environment.
Thanks, Marit.
Yeah, and I'll add to that there are a number of startups out there that are thinking about that. It seems like I support what Marit said on the closed loop approach. It sounds like most of the startups out there are thinking about trying closed loop. Many of them are thinking non-water working fluids, because the wells tend to be lower enthalpy. And it's typically direct use heat angles, because the electricity production angles just aren't quite working out economically yet. There's also a good deal of consternation amongst oil and gas brains on the integrity of wells, in terms of they weren't drilled to become long-term geothermal producing assets, right? So there's a lot of discussion ongoing about that right now, and I think it's really important, but we do need to keep our eye on the ball, and try to make sure that geothermal is economically feasible. No matter what we're aiming for, we want to make sure it makes sense economically, right? And so a lot of economics, project economics, go into the well reuse discussion.
Thanks, Jamie. There's a question from Jose Bucci on, he's a senior reservoir engineer. So his question is specifically on whether geothermal operators put a lot of effort into 3D modeling. But I want to expand that just one bit. And in addition to understanding the answer to that question, could you each give one, say, technology or practice that the oil and gas industry does that you would love to do more of in geothermal? And then also, is there anything from geothermal that you think could be passed over to the oil and gas industry?
Shall I start? And maybe I should start by saying, how long do I have? I have a huge list. Okay.
Only your favorite, Marit. Only your favorite.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So no, look. Even if you look at it with an oil and gas lens, okay. If you look how a typical geothermal project is built, and I'm not saying on closed loop, because that's the future. Okay, that's current. But if you look at the past, and if you look at how a geothermal project has been built, it's a one-off prototype, enthusiastic developer who is absolutely adamant that this is going to work, meaning that in that limited sort of time frame, with a limited amount of money, because money is an issue, you acquire as much data as possible, but also limit it towards your budget, etc., etc. I think you get my point. So the learning from country to country, from asset to asset, from region to region, from reservoir to reservoir is completely lacking. And I say this with a little, let's say, pinch of salt here, because of course it's not completely lacking, because we have operators who have been operating across the globe in multiple assets and environments. But it's that learning, workflow, understanding systematically what the subsurface looks like under conditions that are not easy to handle, because it's high pressure, it's super critical sometimes, it is hot, and it is not easy sometimes to log and to completely control and evaluate what's going on down there. And that is that mindset of understanding your reservoir, knowing your data, retrieving data, putting it in models, testing it, always theory to reality, and doing an optimization workflow on that. If we could do that in geothermal from country to country, from continent to continent, from region to region, or from city to city, I would be delighted.
That's great vision. Thanks, Marit. Jamie, what about you?
Same thing, all of it. So it's so interesting, because when you get geothermal, traditional geothermal folks together with oil and gas folks to talk about how they drill their wells, there's always this eureka moment that happens where oil and gas people are like, wait, y'all don't do that? Why don't you manage pressure drilling? What? You don't do that? Why don't you do that? And geothermal people are like, we can't, it's expensive. What do you want from us? We don't know, we don't do that. And so, just everything about oil and gas needs to be applied to geothermal right now. But I would say if I had to pick a favorite, it is well manufacturing or pad drilling, because that really has unlocked, just squeezed efficiency out of oil and gas, total cost, lots of cost reduction and iteration. And geothermal would really, really benefit from that, in terms of drilling multiple wells on the same site, for one, but also just the process of iterating over and over and over again until you cost reduce and optimize. And so a lot of startups that are coming, into the geothermal space with oil and gas brains are speaking that language. And that's really, it's really promising.
Thanks, Jamie. There are a lot of great questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have the time today to get to all of them, but I want to say a huge thank you to Marit and to Jamie for joining us today, for teaching and being able to learn from both of you. Congratulations and good luck at the World Geothermal Congress next week. And for those that are going to be heading onwards to COP26 in November as well. So congratulations and good luck on the conversations you're going to have. To our audience, thanks for the great participation. A few things I would like to raise as well. One, we encourage you to join us December 1st to 3rd. We have a virtual geothermal workshop coming up. In that workshop, we're going to be talking about a lot of the basics of geothermal, but also where the cutting edge, where innovation is, and where we'd like to understand where, after working through this workshop, and at the end, we're going to capture where do we want SPE to move into the geothermal space? What areas do we want to focus on? What do we see is really important, and what have we learned? I want to give a huge thanks to CGG and to WellTech for sponsoring this session, and also to SPE for allowing us to hold it. We have a lot of questions on energy transition and jobs, and people wondering, how do they move across from oil and gas into geothermal? It's a topic that I know Jamie and Marit could talk on at length, but we're going to be picking it up in another SPE Live on November 11th with CGG and WellTech joining us, and that's going to be moderated by Laura Prekapanu, the SPE Regional Director for Europe. She's amazing, so please do join us on November 11th. Join us December 1st to 3rd at the workshop, and have a great morning and afternoon, everyone. And Marit and Jamie, thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.